Tilea's Troubles, Part 79. The Battle of the Valley of Death. The necropolis Valley of Norochia, west of Trantio, early autumn, 2403. Captain General Lord Alessio Falcone, despite everyone else's confusion when they heard the enemy had left the protection of the city walls to assemble in the nearby Valley of Norochia, did not hesitate in issuing new battle orders. He knew that with a force as huge and unwieldy as this great alliance army, containing soldiers from 5 different realms, any decision on his behalf could engender a hazardous delay in deployment. It was generally agreed the enemy must be expecting to gain some advantage from choosing to fight outside the city walls. Although some believed a relief force must be on its way to join the enemy host, most thought it was glaringly obvious why the Undead wanted Trantio's ancient necropolis to be their battleground. Their reinforcements were, in effect, already present. They just had to claw their way out of their graves to muster with the already animated corpses serving their vampire masters. Lord Alessio had incorporated both possibilities into his tactics. If there was a force on its way, then it would surely be intercepted by the mounted force he had ordered to skirt north of the city. The horse soldiers' manoeuvre had been intended to prevent any enemies escaping Trantio, thus unliving to fight another day. But those same riders were also very well placed to engage any relief force. Meanwhile, if the vampires did intend to bolster their strength with warriors newly raised from the ancient graveyards and tombs, then speed of deployment was of the essence. The army must limit the time available for further necromantic machinations. And so the Allied army, consisting almost entirely of foot soldiers and artillery, having been specifically selected for an assault of the city walls, marched swiftly and boldly to array upon the western ridge of the valley. Despite the horrific spectacle of the enemy silently forming up on the eastern slopes. They performed their manoeuvres well, thanks to the several drills Lord Alessio had required of them during the march. 3 times he had ordered them to form from marching column into line of battle, their performance improving on each occasion, despite the fact that he had slightly altered their final disposition every time. Lord Alessio needed the Allied contingents to act cohesively in the field, and to know that they could and would follow his orders promptly and exactly. He had ordered them to assemble from camp and to march in a specific order each day, all the better to facilitate his orders for deployment. Unlike their practices, however, this time budge barrels were unloaded and powder distributed, the handguns made ready, all matches lit, and the giant Colossus construct was conjured from its slumber upon a covered pallet carried by 3 massive wains, to take its place on the far left of the line. The Captain General's own army was mainly concentrated on the right of the line. He intended these, being the soldiers he most trusted, to secure that flank from any enemy attempt to outmaneuver the army. He also concentrated the army's artillery on this flank, no less than 6 great cannons and 4 master engineers, 4 of the component contingents having brought their own engineers to tend their own standing army pieces. There was a brace of Pavonen guns, another 2 Porto Maggioran, as well as Riemann and Lucinen pieces, all of which were also shielded by his own troops. He expected the guns to deliver several crucial and crippling blasts against the foe, and was therefore keen to ensure that they could not be interfered with by the enemy, a further reason to have his own trusted soldiers on that flank. On the furthest flank was Lord Ned's hunting pack of demigryphs, the fastest troops Lord Alessio possessed, commanded by his most ferocious commander. This was the only mounted company he had not sent away with the interceptor force heading to the north of the city. If anyone was to prove a match for whatever might attempt to break through or ride around the flank to attack the guns, then it was Lord Ned and his monstrous cavalry. Nevertheless, to assist them in this task was a company of handgunners, who might at least distract the enemy sufficiently to allow Lord Ned to bring his own company to bear upon them. Next in line, towards the army's centre, was his large regiment of spears and his crossbow. And beyond these Portamajorans, upon the lower ground, were massed troops of the allied forces. The Cathaean mercenaries of the Archlector's Riemann army stood at the front, crossbowmen and halberdiers with banners showing the keys to Moor's Garden, while the Verezan's large pike regiment and crossbowmen stood between them. Behind them was the smaller Lucinan pike regiment, bearing a royal banner of 3 fleurs-de-lis, as they served a king, and to their left was the 2nd Company of Portamajoran handgunners. Further left were young Lord Silvano's Pavonans, archers, halberdiers, handgunners, liveried almost exactly alike the Portamajorans. Each regiment's original strength had been reduced by constant war, yet they were still a significant force. Silvano personally commanded the halberdiers, not too proud to fight on foot. The 2 huge blocks of baggage were clustered behind them, with an unusual halfling war machine nestled in between. Similarly, some might say suspiciously, close to the baggage, Barone Iacopo and his Verezan halfling archers had formed up further to the left. The Barone commanded his soldiers personally, praying that although his bowmen could not hope to match the range of the human crossbows or the punching power of the handgunners, they would make up for these deficiencies with the skilled accuracy of their archery. Out on the far left flank, again because Lord Alessio trusted them, marched the plate-clad Portamajoran veterans known as the Sea Wolves. Finally, upon the army's extreme flank, strode the Portamajoran Colossus, as tall as the tallest of giants, if not taller, and fashioned of enchanted bronze and silvered steel, containing massive and massively intricate iron gears and clockwork mechanisms. Upon the eastern side of the valley, the vampire high priest Biagino watched as the living army assembled. Standing with his disciplinati di Nagash, the resurrected corpses of the same Morite dedicants he had marched with when he too had been alive, it crossed his mind that perhaps he should have begun the advance against the enemy earlier, despite the fact that his own force had yet to fully assemble. This thought, however, was a fleeting notion, and was soon lost as he scrutinised the enemy army, attempting to assess where the dangers lay and spot any potential weaknesses. Worryingly, it seemed to him very clear that there were plenty of the former, and very few, if any, of the latter. Never before had he seen an army so large. Viadazan and Riemann armies he had marched with when alive had been considerably smaller, and they had had nowhere near as many guns. It also occurred to him that there were no discernible horse soldiers, so that which he could now see was most likely only a portion of the enemy's true strength. Their army must have been truly massive on the march. Where are the horsemen? He wondered. Are they out on the flanks, concealed by the lie of the land? If so, then the situation was worse than he had previously thought. What chance did his army have if surrounded entirely? Or have they been ordered to ride elsewhere? Whatever the truth, whatever tricks the enemy were attempting, he had played his hand. Now he should see it through. If he broke the foe before him, he could deal with the horse soldiers later, and if his enemies were trying to outflank him, then delay would only give them more time to do so. This, right now, was his moment, his chance to prove himself to his mistress and defeat the greatest army sent against her yet. Biagino, his 3 thralls, and his mob of rotting cultists stood on the right of the army's centre. Further right was a large regiment of skeletons, the corpse cart, his skeleton riders, and a slavering pack of dire wolves. To his immediate left were 2 more large regiments of skeletons, one of which was obscured from the enemy's sight by the huge church occupying the middle of this stretch of the valley. Out on the right flank proper, his Vargeists lurked behind a large mob of zombies, created from those poor souls who had foolishly returned to scratch a living around the ruins of the city of Trantio after the Pavonans abandoned it and the ogres then ransacked it. Beyond them slunk the huge Terrorgeist, and beside that the even more massive Mortis engine drifted ethereally. This had a body of undead ogres before it, and a regiment of Graveguard beside it. Outermost, on the right, rode a company of wraiths. With the merest flick of his wrists, his army entirely beholden to his necromantic will, Biagino commanded his dire wolves and hex-wraiths to advance. All the better, he thought, to get a feel for how the enemy intended to proceed, and how they might respond to the sight of such creatures of the night moving towards them. He was no general, never had been, but the gift of undeath had given him access to occasional fits of determined confidence bordering on careless arrogance. While the wolves loped between the ancient tombs towards the Porta Majorans, massed on the opposite slope, the wraiths moved boldly on the far right towards the colossal construct. Due to the nature of their deployment and the lay of the land, nearly every living soldier could see these two bodies advancing. But rather than presenting a threat and eliciting fear, the act of moving ahead of their own lines merely made them appear weak and paltry. The crossbowmen before the wolves calmly hefted their now spanned weapons to fit their bolts, while the gunners upon the higher slope blew upon their coals to prepare for their first volley. There was activity in the largest of the valley's walled graveyards, for a pack of ghouls was busy pulling up the more recently buried bones, sucking out the putrid marrow and chewing on the foul, fetid flesh still clinging to them. There was a plentiful supply, for many of the dead from the recent War of the Princes had been interred in that yard, including many more who'd been executed as undesirables by the Pavonans after their conquest. The ghouls' feasting was now disturbed, however, for despite their ever-ravenous hunger, they could not fail to notice the gathering armies upon the valley sides. As soon as Captain General Lord Alessio spotted the approach of the undead vanguard, he ordered the entire army to advance. Lord Ned Black led his hunting pack forwards, cautiously at first, to allow the spearmen beside him to match his move. In the centre of the line, the pikemen began their own advance, forming a column to manoeuvre between the crossbowmen and handgunners flanking them, thus allowing for volleys of bullet and bolt even as they moved. The allied army's wizards and priests, although barely noticeable as they conjured and prayed, were busy. The priests blessed the Verezan pikemen with Holy Moor's protection, while Lord Alessio's court magician, the Arabian Hakim, felled 4 of the zombie cultists accompanying Biagino with a banishment spell. But it was the Colossus that achieved the most astonishing magic, inflicting Shem's burning gaze on the hex-wraiths with such power that all 5 of the ghostly yet dangerous riders were dissipated entirely from the mortal realm. A cheer went up from the nearby Portamajoran sea-wolves and the halflings, the only allied regiments close enough to witness the event. Their cheer died away, however, when they saw the Terrorgeist and the Mortis engine still moving up towards them. While every cannon on the hill was turned to target those same monstrous entities, the handgunners and the crossbowmen let loose such a volley that not one dire wolf remained to continue its probing advance. This elicited a cheer from that flank of the allied army. Biagino frowned, as he was now becoming fully aware of just what the enemy might do before his forces even managed to engage them in combat. He peered up at the massive artillery battery on the hill, and from the absence of both smoke and sound, he knew they had yet to be fired. Squinting to make out details, despite the painful light behind the guns, he was very dismayed to see where they were aiming. There was a moment of quiet after the sharp rolling crackle of the handgun volley had dissipated. Then, suddenly, the valley was filled with the rolling blast of the entire battery. Not one gun failed to fire, perhaps due to the attendance of no less than 4 different City Realms master engineers. First, the Pavonan cannons sent magically flaming round shots at the Terrorgeist, one missing, but the other tearing right through. A split second later, the Riemann gun sent its own iron bullet into the beast, and it slumped to the ground, bereft of undeath. Before the sea-wolves could begin to cheer a second time, the 2 Portamajoran cannons and the furthermost Verezan piece sent no less than 3 balls into the Mortis engine, breaking off several shards of whatever foulness it was made of. For a moment, it seemed that it might continue its advance, but it broke into 2, as if unfolding, then collapsed in pieces to the ground. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, perhaps boosted by the wave of foul magic that washed out, howsoever weakly, from both monstrosities, to caress the living soldiers and unnerve them. But it was brief, and as it passed, the living soldiers knew full well what had been done. A mighty cheer erupted. The loss struck Biagino. It was not so much painful, more like being winded, as if a considerable portion of his own strength had been sapped away. The only parts of his army, all ready to advance, had been immediately obliterated, while the remainder had yet to take even one step towards the enemy. Its two mightiest components had been blown apart like nothing more than dry leaves. For the briefest moment, a burning rage threatened to overcome him, a bestial fury which made him want to throw himself and his whole army at the foe, wild and reckless, regardless of the consequences. He yearned to rend their flesh, snap their bones and drink deep of their lifeblood, to sate his ravenous hatred and punish them for daring to oppose him. But the desire quickly passed, and a clarity, born of his cautious cunning, now suffused him. He knew that to advance in the face of such a foe would mean the certain destruction of his own army, the foe, at best, being only wounded. If there were more vampires in his army than only himself and Tusco, more necromancers than solely his new servant Pascal, then perhaps sufficient etheric winds could be woven, enough necromantic magic conjured to repair and sustain the army in the face of the enemy's thunderous volleys. But he knew it were not so. He had lost so much already, before the fight had even begun, and to continue this battle would mean certain defeat. His mistress, the Duchess Maria, did not send him here to perish, or at least not to do so while barely scratching the enemy. If he were to risk all, it should not be to some small purpose, but to some great advantage. The ignominious destruction of his entire army was not commensurable with the mild mauling of the foe. More than this, Biagino revelled in his new condition, bringing with it the promise of everlasting undeath. He refused to allow pride or anger make him sacrifice all he had gained, and chose not to risk true death this day. So he gestured this way and that, as if doing nothing more than moving imaginary chess pieces, but in truth signalling his lieutenants across the field. Within a moment, his will was done. The necromancer Pascal de la Cava bowed almost imperceptibly, and commanded his regiment of skeletons forwards, into what had already proved to be a killing zone, while the vampire Captain Tusco snarled a command to send the mob of zombies shambling towards the foe. When the ghouls in the graveyard began pouring out, yearning to feast upon the zombies' decaying flesh, Tusco summoned enough magic to bind them to his service, and thus turned them towards the enemy too. For a moment, Pascal hesitated, having noticed the massive body of spearmen advancing to his left, but before he could decide whether to wheel his troops to face them, or to continue his march directly on, a lashing hail of missiles was loosed from the soldiers and guns on the hill opposite. All around him, his bony warriors were breaking into pieces, the clitter-clatter of their shattered bones clunking from one fleshless anatomy to another, rattling off the vacant skulls and between the empty rib cages of their comrades. Pascal was himself pierced several times over by the sharp shower of shards, and fell to the ground, clutching at his face in an attempt to protect himself, whilst muttering the words of a spell he thought could keep at least a part of his regiment on their feet. Upon the far side of the field, a storm of arrows, bolts, bullets, round shots, and even the Colossus's enchanted flames tore bloodily into both the ghouls and the zombies, but could not find their mark on the vampire Tusco, for he was skulking behind the stone ruins, while conjuring every scrap of magic he could to keep his zombies intact a little longer. All this was as Biagino intended, for his only purpose now was to escape. The walking corpses he had ordered his lieutenants to lead forwards were to be his rearguard. He had left them upon the field of battle merely to buy himself time, knowing full well that they would most likely fail to reach the enemy lines. The living soldiers were to be distracted by the task of blasting away at the regiments before them, their vision obscured by clouds of heavy black powder smoke filling the valley like a bowl. By the time his enemies had begun picking their way through the valley's heaps of stone and over the tangled remains of his soldiers, Biagino was already gone, surrounded by a crazy mob of flagellant zombies, hurtling through the ancient, ruinous village to the valley's east. Those with him did not include every one of his soldiers who fled the field, however. Even in flight, gripped by panic fear, and filled with dread at what he must report to his beloved Duchess, the urge to survive remained foremost in his thoughts. So it was that he had spoken to his second-in-command, Tusco, as he left the field, ordering him to take the bulk of those remaining in the centre and the left of the line and retreat in haste and noisily to the north, while Biagino himself, his La Fraternita di Morti Irrequieta thralls, and his Disciplinati di Nagash would flee eastwards, with neither drum nor horn to advertise their presence. Let the enemy pursue Tusco, not him. And wherever the enemy's horsemen were, let them find Tusco, not him. His was to be a long journey back, navigating a wide arc through the wildest of places, his bodyguard carried by tireless legs, while he drew vigour from the sheer will to avoid true death.